The day the world ended, I was wearing borrowed chainmail that smelled like rust and old sweat, standing in the shadow of a castle that had survived 1,000 years of war. I remember thinking how ridiculous it all was. The castle sat on a low hill surrounded by rolling countryside, its stone walls thick and uneven, crenellations chipped by time, flags snapped in the wind, lions, crosses, sigils I didn't recognize. People milled around in tunics and cloaks, laughing, drinking, pretending the modern world didn't exist. Phones were tucked away, cars hidden beyond the tree line. For one weekend, we were medieval again. I'd come with my older brother, Mark. He was the history nut, the one who owned the armor and the fake swords. I was just there because he begged and promised me free mead and no signal. "Just try to enjoy it," he'd said while tightening my borrowed helmet. "When else do you get to drink beer in a castle and legally hit people with weapons?" Fair point. Trumpets sounded from the inner courtyard, and the crowd cheered. Knights paraded past on foot and horseback, armor gleaming. Vendors shouted about pies and stews. Somewhere, a lute was being brutally mistreated. That was when the screaming started. At first, I thought it was part of the show. Reenactments always had dramatic death scenes. But this screaming was wrong, raw, and panicked, cutting through the music and laughter like a blade. People turned. Near the outer gate, a man stumbled into view. No costume. Jeans, hoodie, face pale and slick with blood. He tried to speak, failed, then collapsed to his knees. Behind him, someone else came through the gate. They moved badly, jerky, unbalanced. One of them had an arm bent at a wrong angle, bone pressing against skin. A woman in a tabard laughed nervously and clapped, assuming it was an actor committed to the bit. Then one of the actors lunged and bit the man next to her in the neck. The scream that followed froze everything. Blood sprayed across linen and wool. The bitten man staggered backward, hands at his throat, eyes wide with disbelief. The attacker didn't stop. He tore, snarling, teeth working like an animal's. That was the moment the word zombie entered my mind. Not as a joke, not as a movie reference. As a terrible, impossible explanation that somehow fit perfectly. People ran. Costumed knights dropped swords and fled. A horse reared and threw its rider. Someone yelled for security. Someone else yelled that this was fake. Mark grabbed my arm. "Inside," he said. "Now." The castle gates were already swinging shut. The reenactment staff, actual professionals, it turned out, were reacting fast. Thick oak doors slammed closed with a boom that echoed through the courtyard. Iron bars dropped into place. The outer portcullis screamed as it lowered. The sound of bodies hitting wood came seconds later. We stood there, dozens of us, breathing hard, staring at the gate, as if it might explode inward at any second. Screams echoed from outside, cut off abruptly one by one. I wanted to throw up. "What the hell was that?" someone whispered. Mark didn't answer. He was staring at the blood on my sleeve, his face tight. Within minutes, the castle was locked down, gates sealed, bridges raised. The stone walls that had once kept out armies now held back whatever was out there. We didn't know yet that the same thing was happening everywhere, only that we were trapped inside a medieval fortress with no plan, no weapons that mattered, and no idea if help was coming. That first night, we huddled in the great hall. Fires burned low. Phones were useless, no signal, no news, just failed calls and dying batteries. The reenactment organizers tried to keep order, but panic crept in anyway. By morning, the bitten were dead. By noon, one of them stood back up. I will never forget the sound of chainmail scraping stone as a man I'd shared a bench with the night before lunged at the nearest person, jaw snapping, eyes empty. He took a spear through the chest from one of the mounted knights before anyone could scream. That's when denial finally died. The castle became a refuge by accident. By the end of the first week, it became a fortress on purpose. Months later, as I write this by torchlight with ink scraped from burned books and paper torn from ledgers, the castle feels less like a reenactment and more like the world rolling backward. We wear armor because it works. We fight with steel because bullets ran out. We eat from the land, patrol the walls, ring bells instead of sirens. The dead still come, and the castle still stands. But that first day, when laughter turned to blood, and history rose to meet the future, that was when everything began. The first siege wasn't a siege in the way history books describe it. There were no banners, no war horns, no organized ranks advancing with ladders and towers. Just a slow, relentless gathering of bodies outside the walls, drawn by noise, light, and the simple fact that we were still alive. At dawn, on the second day, I climbed the north wall with Mark and a handful of others. Mist clung to the fields below the castle, curling around the rocks like breath from something sleeping. From above, the land looked peaceful. Then the mist shifted. Figures emerged one by one, dozens at first, then hundreds. They stumbled across the grass, bumping into each other, heads jerking up toward the walls. Some wore festival wristbands. Some still had bits of medieval costume hanging from torn flesh. A few wore nothing but hospital gowns. "Jesus," someone whispered. The castle had been built for war. Thick stone walls, narrow gates, murder holes above the main entrance, arrow slits designed to let defenders kill without being killed. But none of us were soldiers. The reenactors helped. That's the part people always misunderstand when I tell this later. These weren't weekend cosplayers. Many of them trained in historical combat, archery, horsemanship. They knew formations. They knew how to hold a wall. What they didn't know was how to fight something that didn't feel pain. The first wave reached the walls just after sunrise. They didn't charge. They wandered forward until they hit stone, then pressed against it, hands clawing uselessly. More came, and more. The dead stacked up, bodies leaning against bodies, creating ramps of meat and bone. That's when the screaming started again, this time from us. Arrows worked. Spears worked better. When a bolt punched through an eye or skull, the dead dropped and stayed down. But every kill meant leaning over the parapet. Every second spent exposed, risking a grab, a bite, a fall. I remember the weight of the spear in my hands, the way it vibrated when it struck bone. I remember thinking that I'd only ever used it before to poke at hay bales. Mark stood beside me, jaw clenched, moving with grim efficiency. He didn't look at the faces anymore. None of us did. By noon, the field was carpeted with corpses. By evening, more arrived. We learned fast. Silence mattered. Fire mattered. Height mattered. The drawbridge stayed up. The gates stayed shut. We pushed bodies away with long poles so they couldn't pile too high. That night, something worse happened. One of the cooks bitten earlier in the chaos, unnoticed under layers of wool, died in her sleep. She turned before dawn. The scream came from the sleeping quarters, echoing through stone corridors. Panic exploded. People ran blindly, tripping over bedrolls and benches. Someone slammed a door and locked it, trapping others inside. I was half asleep when Mark dragged me upright. "Inside the armory," he said. "Now." We barricaded the door with a weapons rack just as something slammed into it from the other side. Wet sounds, snarling. The smell of blood crept under the door. That was when the rules became law. Bitten meant death. Death meant burning. No exceptions. The next morning, the organizers called a gathering in the courtyard. They stood on the steps of the keep, faces hollow, voices hoarse. "We can't pretend this is temporary anymore," said Eleanor, one of the senior coordinators. She'd been running medieval events for decades, and somehow that made her the closest thing we had to a leader. "No rescue has come. No helicopters. No soldiers." She paused, letting that sink in. "We survive here," she continued, "or we die here." Work assignments followed: guard rotations, rationing, sanitation, foraging parties under armed escort. Anyone with useful skills stepped forward: blacksmiths, farmers, medics, carpenters. The castle stopped being a venue. It became a town. Weeks passed. The dead came in waves, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, drawn by storms, by sound, by nothing we could explain. We adapted. Dug pits, reinforced gates with scrap metal and beams, boiled water, burned the dead in trenches beyond the walls when it was safe enough to lower the bridge. Armor became daily wear. Leather first, then mail for those on the walls. Helmets were mandatory. Bite-proof layers mattered more than comfort. We stopped talking about when help would come. We started talking about winter. That was when the scouts returned with bad news. From the western tower, you could see smoke on the horizon. Not drifting, rising straight up. Someone else was out there, and they were coming closer. The smoke wasn't there the next morning. That was worse. From the western tower, I scanned the horizon with a battered pair of binoculars scavenged from a car in the overflow lot weeks earlier. The countryside rolled away in greens and browns, peaceful if you ignored the black stains where we'd burned bodies. No movement, no smoke, no sound except wind and crows. "They don't want to be seen," Mark said beside me. That idea settled like a stone in my gut. Zombies didn't hide. People did. We doubled the watches. Quiet hours were enforced, no shouting from the walls, no unnecessary fires at night. The castle learned restraint the way medieval towns once had, by necessity rather than choice. 3 days later, they came openly. A white flag appeared first, tied to the end of a spear, and raised slowly from the tree line. Behind it, a group of maybe 15 people approached at a careful pace. They wore scavenged gear, motorcycle helmets, sports pads, mismatched armor pieces. Some carried rifles slung low. Others had melee weapons. They stopped well outside bow range. "Don't shoot," someone called. A man's voice, strong, confident. "We're not infected." No one on the walls responded. Eleanor stood beside me, arms folded inside her cloak. "Open the postern gate," she said quietly. "2 guards only. Archers ready." The small side gate creaked open just enough for conversation. The man with the white flag stepped forward. He had a beard, a scar across his cheek, and the easy posture of someone used to being listened to. "Name's Cole," he said. "We've got a camp about 5 kilometers west. Been watching this place for weeks." "You brought the dead with you," Eleanor said flatly. Cole nodded. "Didn't mean to. Hard to avoid." That was the truth. We'd learned that much. They wanted trade, food, medical supplies, shelter. In exchange, they offered ammunition, fuel, and information. The word ammunition made heads turn along the wall. We let them in. That decision almost killed us. The first night passed quietly. The newcomers were housed in the outer buildings, kept under watch. They told stories of cities fallen, highways clogged with wreckage, the military collapsing into scattered enclaves that either turned brutal or disappeared. They spoke like survivors, too smoothly. On the second night, the alarms rang. A bell clanged wildly from the south wall. 3 sharp peals, the signal for breach. I bolted upright, heart hammering, grabbing my helmet and spear. By the time I reached the courtyard, it was chaos. The outer armory was on fire. One of the gates, unbarred. Dead poured through in a stumbling flood, drawn by the flames and noise, and among them, moving fast and deliberately, were living men. Cole's people. They'd opened the gate from inside. I saw Mark go down near the well, dragged under by 2 dead before I could reach him. I don't remember screaming, but my throat burned afterward, so I must have. The fight was brutal and close. Spears snapped, swords hacked, arrows flew into crowds so dense they couldn't miss. Oil was poured from the walls and lit, turning the choke point into a screaming furnace. Cole died with a crossbow bolt through his throat. By dawn, the courtyard was slick with blood and ash. Mark lived, barely. The bite had missed flesh, teeth scraping mail instead. That sound still wakes me some nights. We lost 14 people. After that, there were no more guests. The rules hardened. Outsiders were turned away or killed if they approached too close. The castle closed in on itself, becoming a world of stone, steel, and routine. Months passed. Crops were planted inside the outer walls. Goats grazed where tourists once parked cars. Children were taught letters by candlelight and spear drills by morning. Time stopped feeling like time. It felt like history repeating. The dead never stopped coming. And then, one winter morning, the horns sounded not the warning bells, the war horns. Someone else had learned how to fight like we did, and they were coming with an army. Winter didn't arrive all at once. It crept in like an illness. The days shortened. Frost lingered on the battlements well past sunrise. Our breath fogged inside helmets, and fingers went numb on spear shafts, no matter how thick the gloves. Food stores shrank faster than we liked to admit, even with rationing. Then the horn sounded. Not the frantic clanging of bells, but a deep, deliberate call that echoed across the frozen fields. Low, measured, confident. Every head on the walls turned toward the eastern road. They came in formation. At first, I thought they were reenactors, old habits dying hard, but these people moved with purpose. 24 at the front, shields locked, spears braced. Behind them, carts rolled forward, pulled by emaciated horses and human muscle. And behind those, the dead, hundreds of them, driven. The living army herded the dead forward with whips, noisemakers, and fire. They'd figured it out, zombies as siege weapons. A moving wall of bodies that didn't break, didn't fear arrows, and didn't care how many fell. "They're not attacking," Mark muttered beside me. His limp was worse in the cold. "They're settling in." He was right. They built camps just outside bow range, dug trenches, set watchfires at night that burned low and steady. They didn't rush the walls. They waited. Days passed. Every night, they sent the dead forward in waves, not enough to overwhelm us, just enough to keep us exhausted. Sleep came in short, miserable shifts. Our arms ached, our tempers frayed. Then the rocks started flying. They'd built catapults, crude things made from scavenged timber and rope, but effective. Stones slammed into the outer walls, cracking masonry that had stood for centuries. One hit the west tower and collapsed part of the parapet, killing 2 guards outright. We responded in kind. Boiling pitch, fire arrows, night raids from the postern gate silent, brutal strikes meant to burn supplies and kill engineers. I led one of those raids. Me, a guy who once struggled to wake up before 9. We moved like shadows, dressed in darkened mail and leather. No shouting, no mercy. When we got back inside the walls before dawn, Our boots were red. The siege dragged on. People got sick. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. One child died of pneumonia, wrapped in furs that weren't enough. We buried her inside the chapel because the ground outside was too hard to dig. Eleanor called a council. "We can't outlast them," she said. "They have more food, more people, and they don't care how many dead they lose." Silence followed. Then Mark spoke. "The aqueduct." All eyes turned to him. "The castle was designed to survive sieges," he continued. "There's a hidden water tunnel that exits below the eastern ridge. I found the reference in the archives. If we can get a force through, we can hit their camp from behind." A gamble, a desperate one. We chose 40 volunteers. I was one of them. We left at midnight, crawling through freezing water and ancient stone, emerging behind enemy lines like ghosts from the past. The camp lay ahead, fires burning low, guards huddled for warmth. We didn't announce ourselves. Fire spread fast in winter. Tents went up like paper. Horses screamed. The dead, confused and drawn to noise, turned on their own handlers. By the time the enemy realized what was happening, their siege was collapsing into chaos. I fought hand to hand that night, shield against shield, breath steaming, steel ringing like church bells. I took a blade across the ribs and barely felt it through the adrenaline. We ran back to the tunnel at dawn as their camp burned behind us. They didn't pursue. They left. The field outside the castle was empty by noon. We'd won. But victory has a cost. The castle was cracked. Supplies were nearly gone, and we'd learned something terrifying. We weren't the only ones rebuilding the old world. We were just the ones behind better walls. After the siege broke, winter still had its claws in us, but something fundamental had changed. We stopped surviving. We started enduring. The cracked walls were repaired with stone hauled from collapsed villages nearby. Mortar was mixed by hand. Lime burned in pits the way it had been centuries ago. Every repair taught us more about the castle, about the people who had once lived and died within these walls, long before the world ended the first time. Metal became precious. Nails were counted. Broken blades reforged. The blacksmith's forge, once a novelty attraction for tourists, became the heart of the castle. I spent weeks there learning how to hammer dents out of mail, how to keep steel from snapping in the cold. No one laughed at the reenactment gear anymore. It was just gear now. Spring came quietly. Snow melted. Crops pushed through the soil inside the outer ward. The goats birthed kids. For the first time since the outbreak, we ate until we were full. Eleanor stepped down that summer. She didn't announce it. She simply stopped giving orders and started following them. Leadership passed to a council, 5 people chosen by vote, though vote meant raised hands in the courtyard, watched by everyone who still had the strength to stand. Mark was one of them. I hated that. He'd become harder since the siege, quieter, more distant. Leadership did that to people. It carved pieces out of them and left sharp edges behind. The castle changed its rhythms. Bells marked the hours again. Dawn patrol, midday meal, evening prayers not to any god most of us could name, but to the idea that tomorrow would still exist. Children grew. That was the strangest part. They ran through corridors with wooden swords, shouting, pretending to fight the dead. They'd never seen a city, never sat in a car, never watched television. To them, this wasn't a return to medieval life. It was just life. We taught them letters using scraps of parchment and charcoal. History lessons ended abruptly, somewhere around the early 2000s, after which everything became myth. The old world, they called it, the way people once spoke of Rome. The dead still came, of course. They always came. But the castle had become an efficient machine. Watchtowers signaled movement with flags by day, lantern patterns by night. Traps lined the approaches, pits, spikes, deadfalls. When the zombies pressed too close, we thinned them with arrows and fire, careful never to draw more than we could handle. Years passed. I stopped counting exactly when. My hair went gray at the temples. My hands grew thick with scars. Mark walked with a permanent limp and carried the weight of every decision like armor he couldn't remove. Then the riders came. They arrived at midday, 6 of them on horseback. Banners, flying real banners, dyed and stitched with symbols I didn't recognize. They stopped well outside our defenses and waited patiently. That alone was alarming. Their leader was a woman in her 40s, wearing lamellar armor reinforced with modern riot plating. She dismounted slowly, hands visible. "We are from the southern lowlands," she called. "We seek alliance." Alliance. Not trade, not shelter. Power. She told us of a city, an actual city rebuilt from the ruins of a modern metropolis. Tens of thousands of people, walls of concrete and steel, factories powered by scavenged generators and river turbines. An army trained from childhood. They're expanding, she said, absorbing smaller holds, destroying those who refuse. Mark asked the question none of us wanted answered. "And the dead?" She smiled grimly. "They've learned to use them better than anyone." That night, the council argued until voices broke. The city would come, eventually, whether we wanted it or not. The castle was strong, but not against an organized force that outnumbered us 100 to 1. There was only one thing we had that they didn't: the castle's final defense, a relic from a darker age. And using it would mean sacrificing everything we'd worked to preserve. The oldest part of the castle was the keep. Everyone knew that. It rose from the center of the fortress like a clenched fist, its stone darker, older, scarred by centuries of siege and fire. Tour guides used to say it had never fallen, that it had been starved, burned, undermined, but never taken. What they didn't tell visitors was why. The passage was hidden behind the chapel altar. I'd walked past it 1,000 times without seeing it. A seam in the stone, a hinge disguised as age. When Mark pressed the right stones in the right order, the wall sighed open, like something relieved to finally confess. The stairs spiraled down into cold. Torches flared to life, fed by oil lines laid generations ago. The air smelled wrong, stale, metallic, old in a way that had nothing to do with dust. The room at the bottom wasn't a dungeon. It was a vault. Chains thicker than my arm crisscrossed the chamber, bolted into bedrock. Iron cages lined the walls, each sealed with locks so heavy they required 2 hands and a prayer to turn. Symbols were carved everywhere, warnings, prayers, names worn smooth by time. At the center sat the bell. Not a church bell, not a warning bell, a summoning bell. "This castle was never just defensive," Mark said quietly. His voice echoed like it didn't belong down here. "It was a lure." I stared at him. "The hills funnel sound," he continued. "The aqueduct, the stone. Everything was designed to draw attackers here. Armies, raiders, rebels." "And then?" I asked. He swallowed. "They rang the bell. The dead came." The castle had once been used to trigger plagues, to draw the sick and dying in, then seal the gates and let disease burn itself out inside stone walls. Survivors rebuilt on the bones. Now, centuries later, the mechanism still worked. Not disease this time. Noise, frequency, vibration. Something about the bell drove the dead into a frenzy, pulling them from miles away, overwhelming everything in their path. A weapon. A doomsday one. If we ring it, I said slowly, we don't just stop the city. No, Mark said. We erase everything between here and them. The council split instantly. Some argued we'd never survive the city's assault otherwise. Others said unleashing that many dead would doom innocent holds, camps, people who'd never even heard of us. What kind of world do we save if we do this? Eleanor asked. Mark didn't answer. Neither did I. The decision was taken out of our hands 3 days later. The city's army arrived on the horizon like a storm front, banners snapping, vehicles grinding forward beside marching columns. Behind them, herded and chained, were thousands of dead. They didn't bother with negotiation. The first shells hit the outer wall at dawn, concrete cracked stone that had stood for a millennium. Sections collapsed. Men and women died under falling masonry before they ever saw an enemy. The dead surged forward. Our defenses held for hours, then minutes, then not at all. Mark found me in the courtyard, blood on his armor that wasn't his. It's time, he said. We descended into the keep as the castle shook above us. Screams echoed down the stairwell. The bell loomed in the torchlight, silent and patient. I'll do it, Mark said. No, I said immediately. He smiled small, tired, familiar. I'm already gone. He handed me his signet ring, the one the council used to seal orders. Authority, legacy. Take them east, he said. When it's done, don't look back. He rang the bell. The sound wasn't loud. It was deep. It sank into my bones, into my teeth, into the marrow of me. The world seemed to tilt. Far away, screams rose not of fear, but of hunger. The dead answered. I ran. By the time I reached the outer gate with the evacuation column, the horizon was moving. A tide of bodies flowed toward the castle, smashing into the city's army from every direction. Their formations shattered. Their engines stalled. Their confidence died screaming. The castle didn't survive the night. Neither did Mark. But the world did. In its broken, terrible way. I don't know how long the bell rang. Later, people argued about it, minutes, maybe hours. Some swore it never stopped, that the sound just sank below hearing and stayed there, vibrating through stone and soil like a memory the world couldn't shake. What I know is that when dawn came, the castle was gone. Not flattened completely, not erased, but broken beyond recognition. The great keep had collapsed inward, its ancient spine shattered. Towers leaned like rotten teeth. Fires burned where the courtyard had once been full of life. And beyond the ruins, the fields were silent. No banners, no marching columns, no dead. The bell had done what it was built to do. It called everything. The city's army never stood a chance. Their dead broke free first, chains snapping, handlers torn apart in seconds. Then the wave came from every direction. Woods, roads, villages we hadn't even known existed. Hundreds of thousands of corpses converging on one place, crushing anything living between them. By the time the sound faded, there was nothing left to move. We watched from the eastern ridge as the last of them tore each other apart, bodies collapsing into heaps so dense the ground disappeared beneath them. When the dead finally stopped moving, it was because there was no one left to bite. The bell had starved them. The price was everything. We buried Mark 2 days later. There was no body to bury, only his ring, cracked down the middle, pulled from rubble by hands that shook too much to hold it steady. We placed it beneath a cairn of stones overlooking the ruins, where the castle's shadow used to fall in the afternoons. No speeches, no prayers, just silence. We didn't rebuild the castle. No one said it out loud at first. But we all knew that place was done. It had given everything it had left to give. Staying would have meant living in a grave. So we moved. The survivors, fewer than half of us, traveled east, just as Mark had said. Wagons creaked under salvaged tools, books, seed stores. Children walked beside goats. Elders rode when they could. We found a valley 3 weeks later. Natural cliffs on 3 sides, a river running clean and cold, old stone foundations half swallowed by moss, another town, another life, long gone. We settled there, and without realizing it, we did the same thing again. Walls went up first, wood this time reinforced with stone. Watchtowers followed. Fields were planted. Bells, small bells, were hung for alarms, never for summoning. We taught the children everything we could remember. Not just how to fight, how to read, how to make things last, how to argue without killing each other. They asked about the castle sometimes, about the great stone home where they'd been born. I told them the truth. That place saved the world once, I'd say, and then it asked to be left alone. Years passed. I grew old. My hands stiffened, my eyesight dimmed, the scars ached when the weather turned. I stepped back from patrols, then from councils, then from anything that required a sword. One evening, a young man sat beside me on the wall. He wore boiled leather armor and carried a spear he'd made himself. "Is it true," he asked, "that people used to live without walls?" I laughed, a dry, surprised sound. "Yes," I said, "for a while." He thought about that, staring out at the darkening valley. "That sounds dangerous." "It was," I said. "We just didn't know it yet. When I die, they'll probably bury me under stone like Mark. Maybe someone will remember my name. Maybe they won't. That's all right. The world doesn't need heroes anymore. It needs builders. The dead still exist, somewhere far off, always will, but they're scattered now, directionless, just another danger, like winter or hunger or fire. We learned how to live with those. We learned how to live with each other again. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves just right through the valley, I swear I can feel it, a deep vibration under my feet, like the echo of something enormous, finally at rest. I don't fear it. It reminds me that even at the end of the world, people still chose to stand together behind walls, light fires against the dark, and turn history into something worth surviving. And that, I think, is how this age will be remembered. Not as the end, but as the beginning of something older,